Hello, everyone. Good to have you back for another episode of Palestine This Week. A lot's been happening, so let's get into another discussion with my regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. How are you, Mouin?
Hello, Nassim. Always a pleasure to be with you.
So, Mouin, there was another UN body, this time one headed by the former chief judge in the Rwanda genocide case, who issued a report concluding that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. It's a report that was published today, Tuesday, 16th of September. I want to ask you about that, but before I do that, I want to begin really with where we left off last week and analyze the fallout from Israel's attack in Doha. Then we will turn to Gaza, the West Bank, um, developments including, I would say, Israel's role in the amplification of anti-Muslim hatred in Europe. Um, but let's start, as I said, with the fallout. There's been more revelations. President Trump, apparently, it seems, was informed an hour before the strike. He, of course, came out and said to Israel, Israel has to be careful, very, very careful about Qatar. Qatar is our ally. Netanyahu has again reissued a threat saying that they may bomb Qatar again. So I don't know if he's listening to Trump. And then on Monday, yesterday, there was a massive gathering in Doha under the heading 2025 Arab Islamic Extraordinary Summit, where they discussed um, Israel's attack. And even President Sisi, he called Israel an enemy. So, so what in your mind have been the key revelations, key developments of the past week related to Israel's bombing of Doha?
Yeah, those are key questions. The Israeli journalist Barak Ravid published on Axios, based on interviews with three senior but anonymous Israeli sources, that Netanyahu gave Trump almost an hour's notice about the bombing of Doha, and that Trump chose not to order Netanyahu to call it off. There are questions raised about this reporting. Some in the Middle East are claiming the story was planted deliberately before the Arab League Organization of Islamic Cooperation's extraordinary summit in Doha that you referred to, in order to kind of drive a wedge between Qatar and the US. My own view, as we discussed last week, is that Israel could not have conducted this attack without US authorization and cooperation. And I'm assuming that the report or some version of it is entirely correct. What we saw this week was, on the one hand, President Trump saying Israel should not bomb Qatar again. He didn't say don't attack Qatar again. He said basically don't drop bombs from the sky on Qatar again. And if you read between the lines, it means next time you do this, carry out an assassination or a poisoning, as you did with Khalid Mash'ad in Amman in 1997 or something. But don't drop bombs on the Qatari capital. And then, even more extraordinarily, you had the Secretary of State, who I call Little Marco for a big Israel, Rubio, going to Israel, standing next to Netanyahu, and saying that Washington's commitment to Israel remains unwavering, not uttering a single word of dissent about Israel's attack on Qatar, and repeating on multiple occasions that the eradication of Hamas remains a U.S. policy goal, and that Israel has Washington's full support to achieve this. In other words, giving Israel carte blanche to attack whomever it wants, whenever it wants, however it wants. Then you had this extraordinary summit, which was really exceptional. You had It was held at leadership level. So you had most Arab heads of state or heads of government in addition to most from member states of the Organization of Islamic Conference. And basically, their final communique was a damp squib, if there ever was one, essentially taking absolutely no concrete measures themselves, but appealing to the great white father in Washington not to allow Israel to do this yet again. Uh, this is the equivalent of, Cinderella appealing to her stepmother to stop the abuse being meted out to her by her stepchildren, by her stepsisters. I mean, the idea, it's basically a formal total abdication of sovereignty and independence. Um, Not only is there a genocide in Gaza, not only has Lebanon been attacked, not only has Syria been attacked, not only has Yemen been attacked, not only has war been waged against Iran, but now a residential quarter in the capital city of a Gulf Cooperation Council member state, the same state that hosts the largest U.S. airbase in the Middle East and that hosts the regional headquarters of Central Command, um, was bombed, and the response was crickets. Absolutely not a single concrete measure announced against either the aggressor or the aggressor's sponsors. And bearing in mind that Israel's defense minister, Israel Katz, on the day of the Doha bombing, published a video of the bombing and said, this is a message to the entire Middle East. Netanyahu openly, explicitly said Israel will continue to hunt down the Hamas exiled leadership until it gets every last one of them. And it seems this isn't really a cause for concern as far as the Arab leaders and leaders of the OIC members are concerned. It's really, you know,
It is baffling. Netanyahu
mm,
came out and said that this is no different to what the US did when it hunted down Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. So we have the right as a democracy to go around. And he also cited the Munich assassinations that we have the right as a democracy to go around wherever we want and kill and assassinate whoever we want. I mean, but what's the hole in that argument?
well, there are lots of holes in that argument, and without getting into the details of the U.S. Operation to kill Osama bin Laden in Pakistan, Al Qaeda was designated by the United Nations as a terrorist organization. Hamas is not, and imagine uh, the Mujahideen Khalq, Iranian opposition organization that is considered a terrorist organization by Iran, and that used to also be considered a terrorist organization by the United States and the European Union, was relocated from Iraq, where it had existed under the protection of Saddam Hussein, to Albania. Imagine that Iran, launches bombing raids on Tirana in order to get these people and wipe out what it calls a nest of terrorists. Imagine, that Turkey starts bombing cities throughout Europe where Kurdish PKK militants, who are considered terrorists by the Turkish government, are holed up. I mean, in addition to this, um, Qatar is actually um, hosting the Hamas leadership at the express request of the United States and Israel. Qatar is engaging as a mediator in this issue at the express request of the United States and Israel. And the senior Qatari official actually said that a few months ago, when when the negotiations came to a standstill, and in order to placate the Americans and the Israelis, that the Qatari authorities asked the Hamas leadership to leave from Qatar, but they were then asked by the Americans and the Israelis to bring them back so the negotiations could resume. Totally sham negotiations, as we all know, but that's not the point that I'm seeking to make. And so the the differences
Well,
are
to add
are
to your
are
point, sorry,
massive.
Moin, Trump did say Qatar has a very poor public relations team, meaning Qatar should be doing more to advertise and promote its role in peacemaking, in negotiations. The idea being that Hamas, as you said, is in Qatar at the request of the Americans. So this knowledge should be more widespread, and Qatar should push. Push the not the fact that it is playing a vital role in mediating, not just in Palestine, but in so many other wars around the world and conflicts around the world. And it's not done that, according to Trump himself, that Qatar should be doing more to promote itself.
Yeah, well, I think what's more important from Qatar's perspective is that it has thoroughly unreliable and untrustworthy allies in Washington who are quite happy to see its capital city bombed in a broader context where the Trump administration, very much like the Biden administration before it, appears to have subcontracted U.S. Middle East policy to the radical extremists in Israel.
Mm. Uh, of course, it's just been a week since the bombing. I mean, the changes in, well, shifts in assumptions about one's security takes time to play out. So we're seeing this in Europe, for example, with the Europeans also looking at the Americans as someone that cannot be trusted with regards to NATO and Russia, for example. Russia's invaded Ukraine. Europeans will take long time to deal with this threat in their own way, with the assumption that the Americans may not support them in any way. So I think, do you think something similar will happen in the Middle East and the Gulf states in particular? Because as I said, these things take time to play out, and the assumptions that were there for the last 2, 3 decades is now shattered. But for them to recreate a new security arrangement, recreate a new Middle East where the Americans are not the providers of security umbrella, that will take time. It won't be happening in a week. It'll probably take 2 years, 3 years, maybe even 5 years. But the point is the belief that America will always be there, that's been shattered. And how that belief plays out will take a while to come into fruition.
Yes, the assumptions that underlie the dependency of these governments on the United States, basically that the United States is the ultimate guarantor of their defense against either foreign aggression or regime-threatening domestic challenges, that no longer exists. I mean, Washington sent a very clear message. It sent a clear message, in fact, some time ago. Not only will we not defend you against Iranian attacks or against attacks emanating from Yemen, but most importantly, we will actually come out and support Israeli attacks on your territory. And so the real question is, who's next? What will Israel be allowed to do next? Because there really is no suggestion that either the Americans or the Europeans have sent a clear message to Israel. You cannot do this again, and if you do, there are going to be serious consequences. As far as these governments are concerned, they have, in fact, for a number of years already been engaged in a process that I've called strategic diversification. While maintaining the umbilical cord with Washington, they have also very substantially strengthened relations with Russia and even more so with China. But at the end of the day, what we saw in this extraordinary summit in Doha on Monday is that these governments, individually and collectively, are incapable of even taking minimal steps to preserve their own sovereignty and independence. When faced with Washington and Israel, even the instinct for self-preservation evaporates. And so the kind of scenario you're talking about, in which these states actually stand up to the Americans and stand up to the Israelis. Well, we have 2 years of evidence, most obviously in Gaza, but also, as I mentioned, in Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen, and Iran, and now in Qatar, that their instinct for self-preservation does not exist when the threat to that preservation is American or Israeli. And so the conditions that you mentioned, I think we would really only see with very different types of rulers in these countries.
I agree with you. I mean, the summit in Doha is disappointing. It was a damp squib. The statements were very weak, to say the least. But I think Netanyahu himself, though, is right, realizing that the threats Israel will be facing in the future is very different. And he issued a statement, where he gave a speech at a conference on Monday, the day when the summit was taking place. I mean, he spoke at length, and he mentioned that, Israel will be facing many new threats, and it has to be a super Sparta-like state. He spoke about Israel becoming more self-sufficient in the development of new weapons and new technology. Um, do you think that was just coincidence? I mean, him issuing those, uh, well, I would say, threats somehow, and giving an appraisal of what Israel is going to be facing in the next decade, years to come. Do you think it was just coincidence, or is it a response to him actually looking at the Arab world and they're gathering to discuss Israel, and also is looking at what's happening in Europe, which we'll get to later on,
Mm.
and the pushback against Israel's genocide in Gaza? He's looking at everything and saying Israel is becoming more and more isolated, and then that is why he gave that speech, which he gave.
Well, Netanyahu's most proficient skill is, of course, demagoguery. And I think the context here is he was speaking to an American audience and also to an Israeli audience, and basically saying that given Israel's changing international environment, Israel has to become increasingly self reliant. I think he even referred to autarky as an economic strategy and so on. But I don't think it was in any way related to the summit in Doha, which came out with the most reassuring conclusions that Israel could possibly have wanted. I suspect that Israel, which already knew nothing was going to come out of this, was even pleasantly surprised that less than nothing came out of this. What I think Netanyahu is referring to is the broader international changes. You know, the collapse in public support for Israel in the West, where even pro-Israeli governments like the British are okay symbolic steps, you know, of putting travel bans on a few Israeli ministers and free and suspending free trade negotiations. But then you look, for example, at what Spain has recently done, which did more in one day than all the Arab states combined have done in 2 years. You look at statements by celebrities, and basically, what I think Netanyahu is saying is that Israel is heading towards international pariah status and increasing isolation, similar to what, for example, Rhodesia experienced in the 1960s and South Africa in the 1970s, and then, of course, Iran and North Korea more recently, and saying that Israel has to prepare for this. I think his message to the Americans was, "You're really the only friends we have left." But of course, that could change as well. The problem is, I think Netanyahu's words were, "We have to be both Athens and Sparta," and with the emphasis on Sparta. Well, Athens, not quite. I mean, Athens didn't, to the best of my knowledge, didn't make its name with mass murder and elevating barbarism to level of the reigning ideology. Sparta, yes, I mean, Noam Chomsky, for example, decades ago, began saying that Israel, if it changes on the current course, is basically marketing itself to the United States as a regional Sparta. The problem with Sparta uh, is that, Athens still exists. Sparta disappeared many years ago. Is that, and I don't suspect that's what Netanyahu was aiming at. But I think, demagoguery aside, it's an accurate assessment that Israel's isolation is growing and is only going to get worse. The real question is, what kind of consequences will this have politically and economically and strategically?
Yeah, the BBC ran an article, sorry, last week. Does Israel face a South African moment over Gaza? And it lists, of course, the ICJ and ICC cases against Israel and Israeli leaders, the various cultural boycotts, including Ireland, Spain, Netherlands, Slovenia threatening to boycott Israel, well, boycott the European Eurovision Song Contest if Israel is allowed to participate, the push towards recognition of a Palestinian state. And there was an interesting moment in the Emmys as well, where an actor by the name of Hannah Einbinder, she went on stage to receive her award, and she said she's Jewish. And she said, "It is my obligation as a Jewish person to distinguish Jews from the state of Israel. Our religion and our culture is such an important, long-standing institution that is really separate to this sort of ethno-nationalist state." And I thought it's a really important moment. I think a lot of many Jews I know are feeling this, that their opposition to Israel, anti-Zionist Jews, are not being portrayed in the media the way many would like it to be. So I think this is probably a moment where many Jews will come out and say that Israel does not represent us. Israel, if anything, is a reason why there is a rise in anti-Semitism. Israel is an ethno-nationalist state, and a Jewish nation and the Jewish people are much older than Israel. I think that kind of sentiment is, do you think is going to be coming out more and more? And there's now space for that to take place.
Yes, it is, and I think it's crucially important. Hannah Arendt in the late 1940s already predicted exactly what we're seeing now, that Israel's trajectory and the trajectory of diaspora Jewry are increasingly diverging to the point of becoming incompatible. You could almost speak now of a process whereby you're ending up with, you know, um, two Jewish peoples, those in Israel, and who are slightly less than half, and the rest, who are found in other parts of the world. And, I think it was Asad Abu Khalil who said that this woman who he'd never heard of before made a more powerful statement in those 2 minutes than did most Arab writers and actors and so on in the course of the past 2 years. So chapeau to her. And also, for not for making clear what this is about, for explicitly using the term ethno nationalist state. And of course, she was immediately denounced by the Haspera Symphony Orchestra as a capo and all the rest of it. Although, according to my information, a capo is not someone who opposes genocide. A capo is someone who assists in the extermination campaign, who assists in genocide. Someone who collaborates with genocide. So that accusation is obviously misplaced. But now, the whole premise of the repression of pro-Palestinian activism during the past years is that it's an assault on Jews. Not only that it makes them feel unsafe, but that it actually threatens them. Well, now when you have this growing number of Jews speaking out against Israel in increasingly stark terms, it becomes very difficult to maintain that you have to silence everyone because it's threatening to Jews, and it's becoming increasingly apparent that the real threat, as has been the case from the outset, is in fact coming from Israel and its apologists, whether Jewish, Christian, or Muslim. It'll be a while, particularly in the current political environment, before that leads to real changes. But I think this particular incident illustrates that very clearly.
Mm. I want to return to a point Netanyahu made during his comments, 50 states, one Israel meeting or conference, whatever you want to call it. So there he blamed Muslims for the rise in anti-Israel sentiments in the West. And in the same week, also, he spoke twice, and a number of Israeli officials issued statements following the killing of right-wing influencer Charlie Kirk. Netanyahu was interviewed by Fox, and even before the suspect was apprehended, he laid the blame on his assassination on Muslims. So in two instances in 1 week where he's saying that the presence of Muslims in Europe is a threat to the West and a threat to Israel. And then we've spoken before, and there's a lot of research to show that many Zionist organizations are funding right-wing extremist groups, including Tommy Robinson. Tommy Robinson, who is the right-wing extremist in the UK, he led a march in London on Saturday, supported by Trump. Trump spoke at the event, and in that event, of course, the Israeli flag is also being raised. So, and you wrote an article just a few days ago on that point, how talking about how Islamophobia and anti-Islamophobia, the rise of Islamophobia is linked to Israel and Jewish, I would say, yeah, right-wing extremists are peddling Islamophobia. Netanyahu is one of the many figures who are actually facilitating and amplifying anti-Muslim voices in Europe.
Yeah, well, briefly, I looked into what is supposed to be a famous saying in Arabic in the Middle East, whether expressed out of fear by Christians or out of hostility by Muslims. And this alleged proverb is, after the Saturday people come the Sunday people. And what it's supposed to indicate is that the Muslims will first wipe out the Jews and then they'll wipe out the Christians. And the way it's structured, of course, it assumes that the Jews are going to be wiped out, but that's only to clear a path to get at the Christians. And the way this proverb has been mobilized by Israel and its flunkies is basically to tell the world, if we lose, you're finished. And on that basis, they need support to keep the Muslim hordes at bay. Now, I looked into this, all the sources that claim this is a actually existing proverb. I consulted with numerous Arab, non-Arab, Christian, Jewish, Muslim specialists, and the unanimous answer I got is that this doesn't exist. I've never heard of it before, and it's basically a figment of the Zionist imagination, popularized by the dean of scholarly Zionism in 1976, Bernard Lewis. And yes, there is an Arab proverb, after Saturday comes Sunday, but it has absolutely nothing to do with religion, let alone with wiping out two of them. It's just meant to indicate the inevitability of cause and effect in any context. But getting back to your point, this is one example where Islamophobia is being deliberately stoked on a massive scale by both the far right and by Israel flunkies, Israeli apologists, who are often one and the same, for basically trying to project this image of a common enemy. And there's another important reason this is happening. Dropsite News recently reported on a public opinion survey conducted for the Israeli Foreign Ministry in the US and for European countries. And what the survey showed was a collapse of historic proportions, a collapse of public support for Israel. And the only silver lining in its analysis was that Israel should focus on stoking fear of Islams and Muslims, because that's really the only message that still resonates with these Western publics. They've had it with Israel, but it is only by constantly stoking this fear of Islam and Muslims that Israel can hope to retain a certain level of public support. And that's exactly what Netanyahu has been doing. You know, he has basically said that the problem Israel is experiencing in the West is not a collapse in its reputation across the board, but no, it is the work of Muslim immigrants. In other words, Western states, institutions, societies are being captured by the hordes of Muslim immigrants that are taking them over, great replacement theory. Um, uh, and then, blaming a political assassination in the United States, also on Muslims. A century ago, these are exactly the same things that were being said about Jews who were leaving Eastern Europe and then Russia and the Soviet Union in growing numbers for Western Europe and the United States. They were the reason that socialism and Bolshevism was taking root. All kinds of the same alarmist demagoguery was used against them, and we all know how that ended.
Yeah, I think you allude to that in your article. I think they've basically replaced the protocols of the Elders of Zion with a Muslim conspiracy with the Brotherhood at the top, a lot of these guys actually believe that there is a Muslim conspiracy to take over Europe. When, if you look at the numbers, it's not the case, and it's just, and even that term itself. I'm a Muslim. I've never heard of that term in my life. I don't know anyone within my circle who has ever heard of
Well,
such a term. And also this idea of the taqiyya, the idea that
yeah,
Muslims.
Taqiyya and Dhimmi. Yeah.
I never heard of this until I started reading
But
far-right
see,
extremists.
that proves you're lying.
I mean, there's no way you can win with people who do not want to see sense, and they're so indoctrinated into their own propaganda. How do you win? And what's chilling though, of course, is you have people like really influential people like Musk and others pushing this on
Yes.
social media, and Netanyahu now is coming out and saying clearly that the presence of Muslims in Europe is a threat to Israel,
Mm.
which I would say is a signal or indication that they will be working hard to make sure that those social media influencers are taking their points from the Israeli, propaganda
Yes.
talking points. So
Yes.
they will be making sure that that happens and they stoke even more Islamophobia in Europe.
Exactly. And I called it, in fact, the protocols of the elders of Mecca. And the reason I did that is because it's a very close reflection of the protocols of the elders of Zion. Not just a fabricated text, but a text that is fabricated to convince its audience that these diabolical, nefarious people are engaged in an organized plot to take over the world, first and foremost, your own country. And it's really beyond words. I mean, Islam is presented as some kind of conscious living organism in which every Muslim, it's almost like when you have worker bees in a beehive or in an ant colony. Each has their assigned role. Your role is to have 10 children, your role is to vote, your role is to blow this up. And they try to present this absolutely fantastical conspiracy, in which has so many multiple dimensions, and on that basis, I felt perfectly comfortable referring to this as the protocols of the elders of Mecca, and to say that basically the only reason these people are attacking Israel has absolutely nothing to do with the reality in the Middle East. They just want to get rid of the Jews so that they can come after you. It's kind of the ultimate demagogic conspiracy theory.
I want to turn now to the situation in Gaza itself. As I mentioned at the beginning, the UN Commission has published a report and concluded that Israel is committing genocide. So I want to get your thoughts on that. But also, if you want to comment on an article about a former Israeli army commander, Herzi Halevi. So he gave an interview. The Guardian reported him, and he said that Israel has killed or injured more than 200,000 Palestinians, which is more or less the figure that's been quoted by the Gaza Humanitarian as Gaza Health Foundation. So the numbers are not propaganda as we are being told, but the numbers, of course, are exactly what was accepted many years before in the various wars that happened previously. So he's confirming the numbers. And then he went on to debunk the claim that Israeli soldiers they take legal advice before they do anything, and this is something that we're told over and over again. He says, Halevi, he says that um, the soldiers do not listen to any kind of legal instructions. The soldiers basically do as they please, and the legal advisors, their function is to justify and defend the atrocities of Israeli war crimes. That's what Halevi is saying. So basically, it sounds to me very much like what Alan Dershowitz does, which is to find legal loopholes to defend the most depraved individuals
Yes.
committing the most depraved crimes. So instead of soldiers guiding the instructions of, instead of lawyers guiding the actions of the soldiers, soldiers do what they want, and the lawyer's job is simply to defend the atrocities and the crimes of Israel. And then this is coming from a senior Israeli
Former chief of
military.
staff.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, look, the Israeli judiciary has always been subordinate to the military, most particularly where it concerns how the Israeli state deals with the Palestinians. This is, from judges in the military courts to the military's judge advocate general, right up to Israel's Supreme Court, which is celebrated as some kind of independent watchdog, but is really a lapdog for the military. Always has been. The evidence is right out there for all to see. So Halevi, the former Israeli chief of staff, basically said in Gaza, I think the term he used is, "We took the gloves off, and this has and we already have more than 200,000 casualties." He didn't say killed; he said casualties. Now, Israel's apologists went out and basically said he said casualties, not killed. So the 200,000 includes killed and wounded. Yeah, that's exactly what the guy said. But how come, somehow saying you've killed and wounded 200,000 people is supposed to get you an award? They're basically saying, since he didn't say 200,000 dead, there's really nothing to see here. And he then says that the military's own legal apparatus basically never found anything wrong with anything that the army did, which, again, you don't have to be an Israeli military chief of staff either to know that Israel has already inflicted hundreds of thousands of casualties or to know that Israel's judiciary, from tip to toe, is and always has been a lapdog for the Israeli military.
And did you want to comment on the new UN Commission report,
Yes, yeah.
Revelation?
So this is it's it's a commission of inquiry that was set up, I believe, in 2020 or 2021 by the UN Human Rights Council. It consists of three individuals. Navi Pillay, former judge, I believe, from South Africa, who was also the chairman of the International Tribunal on Rwanda after the genocide, Chris Sidoti, an Australian legal specialist. And forgive me that I don't, for the moment, recall the name of the third member of that committee. And they've put out periodic reports. Their brief is to look at the human rights situation in both the occupied territories and Israel. So they have a wider brief than the UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese. This is their last report because about a month ago, the three of them simultaneously submitted their resignations. And there was a bit of a lack of clarity about why they did so and why they did so collectively and simultaneously. There were suggestions at the time that they did not want to get caught up in the increasing campaign of sanctions being imposed by the US government against anyone who doesn't support genocide, Israel, the Gaza genocide. And there were suggestions that Navi Pillai, in particular, has a daughter who lives in the United States and was worried she wouldn't be able to visit her grandchildren. But then there was a very interesting analysis by the forensic scholar Norman Finkelstein, where he noted that in his last that the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, in his most recent report on sexual violence, uh, didn't identify Israel as one of the countries on that list, but basically gave them a warning light or something. I can't remember what exactly. And Finkelstein suggests that in willfully rejecting the very thorough research and conclusions reached on precisely this issue by the Commission of Inquiry, and basically adopting wholesale the analysis of known Israel flunkies in the UN operation, that was a last straw for these people, and they decided to collectively resign in protest. Now, they haven't commented on this, they haven't gone public with the reasons for their resignation, so that remains, for the moment, a very interesting report that is worth looking further into. But so now their final report looks at genocide, and as with their previous reports, it's very thorough. It makes very clear that the Genocide Convention calls upon member states not only to punish genocide, but also to prevent it, and points out what the obligations of UN member states are given the current situation. And as they point out, when you have such an overwhelming volume of human rights reports, of opinions by genocide and Holocaust scholars and others, stating explicitly, unambiguously, that Israel is perpetrating genocide against the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip. Well, under such circumstances, and given the duty of prevention, you can't do nothing on the pretext that you're waiting for the International Court of Justice to issue a ruling on South Africa's case several years into the future. And there was another humorous incident, I believe it was yesterday, where Chris Sidoti was asked about the Israeli dismissal of the report. I think he called the commission, the Israeli Foreign Ministry called the commission members of Hamas, or something similar. And he said, they need to do better than just use chat GPT to constantly throw out the same accusation against anyone that points out the crimes they're engaged in.
So, I think 2 weeks ago, we spoke about how the UK government issued a legal position saying that they do not believe Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. That's being challenged here in the UK by a number of
Yeah. May I just interrupt you? What was so extraordinary about that legal opinion is it didn't just say that Israel is not committing genocide. It went so far as to say that there isn't even the threat of genocide. That was quite extraordinary.
It was, and it's been challenged, as I said, and I think more details will come out, and I think we can maybe discuss that next week. But I want to end on the situation in the illegally occupied West Bank, where last week Israel rounded up something like 1,500 men in Tulkarm and at gunpoint took them away. And I think last week also we discussed how studies showed that three quarters, 75% of the people that are being detained in some of the horrific prisons in Israel are actually non-combatants. They're civilians. So one would assume that the lines that of men that were being forcefully taken away as part of, I think, collective punishment for the attack in Jerusalem. That these are also mainly just civilians. They have nothing to do with whatever Israel is accusing them of. These are just Palestinians who are going about their own life, and Israel has arrested them and is taking them to detention, arbitrary detention.
Yeah, I mean, these aren't arrests in the normal sense of the word. These are mass roundups of, for example, all males between 15 and 65 in a particular area. And it's the purpose is collective punishment, humiliation, reminding these people who's boss, intimidation, and so on. And the idea is that, the more and the more often you do this to people across the board, the easier it will be to control them. Well, if that was the case, we wouldn't be having this conversation because by targeting your repression not only at people who oppose you, but more specifically at people who have the wrong religion and wrong nationality, and singling them out for this kind of treatment, you're basically taking a lot of people who may be primarily invested in just trying to lead normal lives, try to support their families and so on. And you're basically leaving them, you're giving them every incentive to do everything within their power to make sure you're no longer around to make their lives a miserable hell.
Actually, let's end on another story, Norman. I mean, so Marco Rubio, U.S. Secretary of State, was in Jerusalem. We saw the pictures and images, and apparently, in private, he has told the Israelis he's okay with annexation. He's green lit, he's fine with that. Of course, officially, Trump hasn't made any kind of statement. So, say for example, in a scenario where Washington says annexation is fine, what happens with the efforts by Western countries to recognize the Palestinian state? I mean, does that derail everything? Does that then mean Europeans have to simply go back to the drawing board and come out with a way to what the next stage is going to be? We can throw away two-state settlements as a solution. We have to find a new way of now addressing Israel's apartheid regime in historic Palestine.
Well, I think the purpose of Rubio's statement, I think he put it in the context of um, if these Western governments go ahead and recognize Palestinian statehood at the UN General Assembly next week, then Israel is going to respond. I don't think he said it explicitly, but quite clearly, what he meant is that if there is recognition, there is going to be annexation in one form or another. Now, you can look at this in two ways. Either this is a final attempt to warn those European and Western states that have indicated that they're planning to recognize Palestine not to do so, um, or it's preparing the ground for acceptance of such annexation if it is indeed conducted as a response to recognition. Whether the European states will now refrain from recognition or whether they will go ahead with recognition and then pretend nothing happens when Israel engages in what is most likely to be a broad but partial declaration of annexation. It's difficult to tell, but the idea that red lines exist in European policy towards Israel is a sham. I mean, we last week I think we talked about this. the E1 settlement project, which the Europeans have since the 1990s repeatedly warned Israel is a red line that cannot pass and will not pass without consequences. Well, it's now being implemented, and the Europeans are desperately trying to pretend absolutely nothing happened. I think the real question is, what will Arab states do in such a circumstance, particularly a government like the United Arab Emirates, which in 2020 sought to justify its normalization with Israel, um, uh, specifically as something it did to prevent Israeli annexation of West Bank territory. Here, too, I think we'll probably hear a condemnation. One last heartfelt plea to the great white father in the White House to please do something, help us, and so on. But, we now live in a world where Israel can do as it pleases, when it pleases, where it pleases, how it pleases. And the only thing that is going to stop it is a concerted, growing campaign by people of conscience around the globe.
Thanks, Mine. As always, pleasure to speak with you, and
Thank you.
see you again next week for another episode. And thank you also for tuning in and listening to our conversation. Before you leave, I just want to remind everyone, please like and share our conversation, and yeah, and hope to see you again next week. Bye bye.